All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session this afternoon. Hopefully, you've been able to attend some of the earlier sessions today and enjoyed those. And let's keep the good times going. So, with our session today, we're going to tackle harness the power of a connected ecosystem with web APIs. And as we put in for this session, we're going to talk about how best in class applications in the learning and development world can be collaborative and work together. Several years ago, there was a big push around having centralized applications within talent management, almost like a one stop shop, if you will. And we're going to contrast that with best in breed applications, using the right tool for the right job. And so, with that, we're going to take a look at how web APIs are part of that glue to make all of that happen. And so, I want to welcome you. My name is Kevin Yount. I'm the Senior Manager of Corporate Learning Technology at Charter Communications. And before I turn it over to my co host, I just wanted to do some housekeeping. On the right hand side of your screen, more than likely, you'll see the chat tab. There's also a QA tab that you can ask questions, and we'll definitely reserve time to go over those. You can also chat in your questions as well that we'll try to handle as we go along. And then finally, we have a few polls for today's session as well. You'll see that polls tab. And so when we present the polls, you want to make sure that you toggle over there to engage in those. All right, so with that, I'm going to toss it over to my co-host. So Heidi, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Heidi Schaefer. I am the lead instructional designer on the corporate learning technology team at Charter Communications. I am super excited to be here with you today. Let's take a look at some of our topics that we're going to cover today. The first topic is what is a web API? Next is architectural diagrams. Then we'll talk about web API business planning. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some real world web API scenarios. Before we get into our first topic, we have a poll, our very first poll. I'm going to go ahead and get that started for you. And our first poll question is, what do you hope to learn today about web APIs from our session? So don't forget to go over to the polls tab so you can start answering that poll question. All right, the poll has ended and it looks like how can I use web APIs back in my learning ecosystem is the winner with all of these sound awesome right behind that. So luckily we're going to cover all of these so no one's going to miss out. Let's dive into what is a web API. Before we get into web APIs themselves, let's take a minute and just define an API. So API stands for Application Programming Interface. And an API allows different applications to communicate with each other without having to know how the different applications have been developed. Essentially, it's a software intermediary that allows two applications to communicate with each other. So when we're talking about web APIs, we're talking about an application programming interface for the web. And there's two different types. You can have a browser API, which can extend the functionality of a web server, or you can have a server API, which extends the functionality of a web server. And in order to further define this, let's illustrate a web API for you. So years ago, when we needed to export goods and services between cities, you could get from one city to the next, but you might have to take back roads and rural routes to get there. Then it would take effort, it would take some time, especially if you had to go around big mountains or deep rivers, you'd have to add time because you'd have to go around those things. So there would be effort and time. And then the industrial push came and highways were built, and that made it easier and more efficient to get to different cities. By adding highways, efficiencies are gained. And so the same is true when it comes to web APIs. When you add a web API, you can gain certain efficiencies. And an example of this can be illustrated with our learning content management system, which is also referred to as an LCMS in our learning ecosystem at Charter, early on in the LCMS, we extracted data to a CSV file, and then our team would take that data or that file, that CSV file, and we turn it over to our analytics team, and then they would have to do some massaging to the file, and then they'd have to import that file into their business intelligence applications for that visualization that we were looking for the data. Um, so that required some work on our end and our analytics team's end. When we added a web API later, it allowed for that clean extraction between, from one application to another with no middleman. And so that is really, what a web API, an example of what a web API can allow you to do. Kevin is going to spend some time next taking a little bit deeper dive into web APIs and discussing architectural diagrams with you.
Yep, thanks, Heidi. Appreciate that. And then we're going to look at, like I said, or like Heidi said, diagrams as it relates to visualizing web APIs, because at times it can get pretty technical, and making diagrams can help abstract that up one level to make it easier to digest. But before we get to that, we're going to put up another poll. And so, Heidi, could I ask that you, thank you very much. All right, so in our poll, there's a second one. It's actually below, I believe, if you have to scroll down in your poll panel. But what I'd like you to tackle is the purpose of a diagram is, or what's the best definition, if you will. Look at those three examples, and we'll see what the group comes back to from a poll perspective. So again, what do you think the purpose of a diagram is? Just a few more seconds. All right, the poll is ended. So let's see. 81% said the first one communicates information in a visual way. And then the second one was pictures tell 1,000 words. And then the finally, illustrations are more valuable than text and data. I think that each one of these have, are right in their own situation. Illustrations are not always better than data and text. And I think it really comes down to the situation that you're in and using the right approach. So, overall, I would agree with the 81% in terms of communicates information in a visual way. That's generally what we're going after from a diagramming perspective. And when we look at that as a real world example that most have probably seen is just simply blueprints. Why do we have architects that put together blueprints? It's because not only does it visualize what they want to create and go down the path of getting approved and so on, but then there's going to be people down the line that need to take those blueprints and actually make it come to fruition, such as your general contractors, your subcontractors. How big are the doors and windows? How wide are they? What materials you're going to use? Plumbing, electrical, all of that needs to be spec'd out. And using diagrams is typically the best way to do it, to visualize it. Because it would be challenging if you were to go after that from just a text or data perspective. And so diagramming really helps us visualize what the end result is. And sometimes if you don't diagram, well, you're going to expect the unexpected. You might get something that you didn't really expect in the end. So as we get into our web APIs, think about that, is that web APIs can be, from a documentation perspective, pretty technical. And if you illustrate it through diagrams, it will help, like I mentioned earlier, abstract that up one level to make it easier to digest and share it amongst your teams or vendors and so on. So let's take a look at a model that we use from a diagramming perspective. It's called the Unified Modeling Language, or otherwise known as UML diagrams. And so what UML diagrams are is simply objects that are illustrated. So in this example, we have this rectangle, and it's an object. And inside of this object, every object has properties, one or more, and it also has actions, one or more as well. And they help define what an object is. Now let's see this in a very familiar example. So let's take a cat as the object. A cat has properties such as its breed, its hair type, its eye color, and so on. And then it also has actions. Cats sleep, cats walk, cats jump, they scratch, they do all kinds of things, right? From an actionable perspective. But the idea behind the UML diagram is to help define it and help explain it better to folks around you. Now let's move this forward into a learning and development example. And I'll use one that is pretty common in learning and development, and that's a learning management system. So learning management systems often have libraries of web APIs. And again, these APIs are just objects that you can interact with. And so in this example, we have a learning object API library for an LMS. This is all fictional, but roughly you can take that forward for the ones that you work with. So one of the web API objects that you can interact with is being able to create a learning object. And when you create a learning object, you have to supply a title, a description, maybe the running time associated with the learning object. Those are all what we'll call required information. You have to have those for implementation of creating a learning object. But there could also be optional attributes as well, or optional actions such as classifications, for example. Maybe there's a taxonomy that you can apply taxons to and so on. Another object or a web API would be the learning object getting a learning object. So you would have to supply the learning object ID in the title, and what it returns back to you is all the other details and metadata behind that learning object. And the final example is this learning object update. Maybe you have an existing learning object in your LMS, you need to update it in some way. Maybe it's the title or description and so on, but oftentimes need to supply the ID in order to make that change. And so you have these libraries of APIs throughout an LMS and many other applications in the learning and development world and beyond. But the idea here is that this diagram helps take that technical documentation from the vendor or whoever wrote it and make it more easy to understand and use going forward. Because not all technical documentation is created equal. Some of it's really good, and some of it I would say there's opportunities for improvement. Now, let's take that example forward now in an actual, like a fictional use case at a high level. So in this example, we have an external application called the application ABC. It is completely separate from the learning management system, but yet it needs to interact with the learning management system. And in this case, it's going to interact with the web API object that's called learning object create. So this ABC application is allowed to create learning objects in the LMS programmatically, rather than actually going into the LMS administrative function and doing it that way. So the way that web APIs work is that every web API object has its own endpoint that you connect to and speak to. It's kind of like that city-to-city example that Heidi was talking about, but in a much, much faster way. Every API has its own endpoint, and that endpoint is nothing more than a URL. And you can see in this example, we have a URL that says https lmsdomain.com. APIs are also versioned because changes will happen. And so you will have version 1, version 2, and so on. And then in this example, you see it says lo/create. Now with this request, being that we're creating a learning object, we need to pass it the data. And that's what you see below the arrow. This data is often called payload. So you're providing the payload to the application via web API. And in this case, we're providing it the title of the course, we're providing the description, the running time associated with it. And as you can see on the right, that's what the web API object is waiting for, that information. The last thing that I don't have listed here, but I do want to call out, is the fact that web APIs are often protected by security. And so what that means is you need to be authenticated in order to provide or get information from the web API. There's all kinds of security protocols out there, but just know that typically in order to get in through the door of a web API, you have to have some type of authentication. And that's always good from a security perspective. So what happens next? So the Learning Object Create Web API takes that information, but what does it do with it? So it takes that information and it uses a very small program, typically a function, and it parses that information, that payload, and it takes the title, the description, the running time, and it parses it and places it inside of its own database. In this example, it's the LMS database. And then from there, the LMS database holds on to that data and it just waits. It waits for that data to be called up and be used within either the application itself or be used externally using the other web APIs. But in this example that I have here, as you can see, we have a learner, let's say on the right-hand side, navigating through the learning management system. Maybe they're browsing for a course or searching for a course. And eventually they might get to that example course that we had injected into the LMS via web API. And there you go. There's the course information, the description, the length of time. And so that's yet one example of web API implementation. Now, later in the session, we're going to cover 3 real world scenarios that we do at Charter Communications. I'm super excited to share those with you guys. All right, but before that, I'm going to pass it back over to Heidi for our next topic. So Heidi, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. So our next topic is upfront planning for your web APIs and how doing this can lay a good foundation for success. So Kevin, can you go to the next? There we go. Thank you. So web API business planning. When it comes to web API business planning, there's really some considerations to keep in mind. Technical requirements, resource planning, cost and budget. This table over here are some of the questions we ask vendors or internal teams. And also, just as a side note, this table, we have added it to the end of the slide deck that is in your resources. So if you want this table later, you'll have it in the slide presentation at the end. But let's go over some of the questions that we asked. So some of these first questions are directed more towards a vendor. So, are there content APIs available? Are there analytics APIs available? Is there an additional cost for the API? Sometimes there is an additional cost. Sometimes you get the content API, but you don't get the analytics API. So you just need to ask that so that you can plan for the future, or when you go to make that jump. Who has experience or expertise or personnel to create the API integrations with other applications? Is it an internal team or is it a vendor? And again, there's cost and time associated with that. Who has the cloud or on-premise infrastructure to handle API integrations? Is it internal to your company, or will the vendor need to handle that? And again, that will impact time and cost as well. Are the APIs well documented with definitions, examples, and our code snippets? Kevin alluded to that a little bit earlier, that some documentation is really good and it includes those code snippets that can really help your internal team get to what they need to pretty quickly. Some of it doesn't have it, but it's still well written. You just need to look at the documentation and take a look and see. And if there isn't any, then that you're probably going to have to spend more time trying to figure it out and do more testing. What form of authentication do the APIs require? Is it a bearer token or some other type of authentication? And a bearer token is essentially just it's a way for the authentication service to verify that someone has supplied the username and password and they're authentic, that they belong to the organization. And then based on that, what permissions do they have for the application? And then it generates this little token that goes back and says, yes, stamp of approval, they're okay to move forward. Are the APIs throttled? Yes or no? And essentially, API throttling is just the process of limiting the number of API requests a user can make during a certain period of time. So it's important to know that, just because if they are going to throttle, you want to know how many requests a user can make during a certain amount of time, because that may lead to some support later that you have to be aware of. And then finally, can API enhancements be requested? And if so, can they describe the process so going forward if you want to make enhancements to the API, what the process is for that. So that is a little bit about Web API business planning, and Kevin is going to next spend some time talking to you about some of our real-world Web API examples from our experience at Charter. But there you go. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Heidi. And yeah, I see, Nicholas, I see your chat that you put in there. Yeah, we can try to, dig up some stuff during the presentation here. But I would also say there's a lot of resources out there from an educational perspective on the API side. You can go to W3 Schools. That's often a go-to place that if just from a getting off the ground situation, but there's many more places out there like that. And from an analytics perspective, yeah, you can do more digging there too. And take a look at other professional organizations. ATD is one of them. With their library that they have as it relates to documentation of, application of learning analytics. I'm sure that's within their documentation, but plenty of other professional organizations out there as it relates to learner analytics. But I would also say don't stop there in terms of the L&D industry, the learning and development industry. Take a look at other industries as well, like sales or customer service or like those types as well. They also use analytics in different ways, but oftentimes those can translate in creative ways into the L&D industry. So yeah, take a look. Hopefully that's helpful to get you kickstarted. All right, so getting into our last scenario for today, the real world web API scenarios. So I'm going to present 3 of them that Charter Communications takes on. But before we do that, I'm going to throw an open-ended poll to you. Now, this platform on the poll side, let's see, we don't have, they're all multiple choice, so you'll have to chat this in. So on the chat side, I'm going to ask you to answer this. So, we're about 3/4 of the way through our presentation at this point. So what are ways that you have thought of since the beginning of this presentation where you could potentially see the use of web APIs back in your job? So again, have you brainstormed any ways that you potentially use web APIs back in your job? If so, let us know what those might be. So we'll give you some time to type those in there. But if you're still kind of stuck and saying, I'm still not quite sure, that's okay too. Like I said, we're going to throw at you 3 scenarios that we use within Charter, and hopefully those can help you brainstorm into the future. So I'm just going to pause here to see if there's any flow coming into chat. So users taking training on another platform, such as LinkedIn Learning and show completion in the LMS. Thanks, Tom. We're actually going to take a look at an example just like that. We'd love to bridge the gap between content development, software, and understanding learner response. Okay, thanks, Nicholas. Creative solution. I can see some implementation of that for sure. And yes, Brandon, this is a 60-minute presentation. We have just allowed additional time for questions and such. It's always the X factor when it comes to these sessions. Okay, very good stuff. Course calls from our content platform to our LMS. Thanks, Derek. We have a similar example to that as well that we'll share through diagramming in this presentation in just a moment. Bridge the gap between CRM and LMS. Yeah, that's very cool. Customer relationship management and the learning management system. I can certainly see some applications there too. That's good stuff. Maybe also a KMS, a knowledge management system, and a LCMS or some other learning application. Cool stuff. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate you typing those in there. So let's get into our first example. First scenario. Skip over that poll. We just polled that. It's all about sharing content. And here's an example that we use within our organization. So on the left-hand side of this diagram, we have a custom learning portal. This custom learning portal is created from a requirements document that says it needs to look in a certain way, but it also has to function in a certain way that some, out of the box vendor tool couldn't take on. And so, that was the purpose of creating this custom learning portal for an audience or a group of audiences. And let's just imagine that this custom learning portal has text and images, but it also has a search field. That search field is going to be used to connect with our learning content management system. That is a completely separate application. And so in this learning content management system has a group of documents. Those documents might be videos, they could be images, reference guide, participant guides, any number of things. But we want these things to work together. And web APIs are going to be the glue that make that happen. So the way this is going to work is that you have that search field in the custom application. The learner types in some type of keyword or keywords, and they hit enter or press the little magnifying glass. And then what happens is that is wired up and it reaches out and connects to the web API endpoint for the LCMS as it relates to the search. And the idea is that it's going to get one or more documents and it's metadata. So it's going to provide that search API endpoint, as well as going to provide the keywords. And once that happens, if I go to the next one, the learning content management system on the right-hand side will parse that information. It'll do its search programmatically within its own context. And it's going to find some documents that have those keywords in it. Maybe it's associated with the title of the document or descriptions or the body of those documents. But in any case, it's going to find some and it's going to ignore the others. And it's going to provide that either the actual documents itself in binary form, or it's actually going to provide the metadata behind it, such as title, description, URL, those types of things. And it provides that back to the custom learning portal, which then handles that data and then presents it in a custom fashion in some search results page or something like that. So that's an example of sharing content. Now the key here is think a little bit larger than just this one example. This learning content management system acts as a centralized hub for content. It's serving to this one custom learning portal, but who's to say that you don't have 50 of these custom learning portals? And with that, you're single sourcing your content. Because think about the alternative to this. How are you going to get that content from the learning content management system into those custom learning portals? Back in the day, you might have to like copy and paste these documents into these separate entities, if you will. And that creates a content management nightmare. And so this is a great implementation of how you can single source content and share them amongst other applications in your ecosystem. Let's move on to scenario number 2. And scenario number 2 relates to sharing data. And I believe someone had chatted this in. And so here's an example of sharing data between two learning and development applications. So on the left-hand side, we have what's called a learning reinforcement application. And this is, think of it, it's solely focused on what happens after somebody attends a learning event. It could be an instructor-led training event, it could be e-learning, but this learning reinforcement is to help them reinforce as they get back onto the job. Well, let's imagine that we have folks, learners within our organization that are completing these learning reinforcement events, but we want the data for that completion to flow back into our learning management system so it appears on their learner transcript. So how are we going to do that? We're going to do it through web APIs to connect these two. So this one takes a special implementation where you have this middleman, if you will. This middleman is some type of on-premise or cloud server or infrastructure. And it's going to do a nightly completion check. It's going to say who has completed a certain program on the learning reinforcement side. And if they've completed it, let's get them credit on the right-hand side in the learning management system. So the first step is that during that nightly check, it's going to reach out into the learning reinforcement application through a web API endpoint. It's going to request a specific program ID, and it's also going to say, I only want the completion status. Only those folks that have completed the session or that program the previous day. And so it's going to use that web API object that I have on the left-hand side to do that parsing, the looking, and to then provide it back into that cloud server. And then it's going to say, oh, okay, well, with that program, ABC reinforcement program, learner John Doe has completed that on this particular day. And so that server will then take that information and then it will translate it for the next web API call that it's going to do to the LMS. And so on the LMS side, it's going to send that data to an API endpoint. It's going to provide the learning object ID, the learner ID, their completion status when they completed. It's going to give that payload to the LMS onto the transcript web object for that particular person. So here's their the person with their learner ID and so on. And then at that point, what happens? Well, as we saw earlier, it gets stored in the LMS's database. And then the next time John logs into the LMS and goes to his learner transcript, he can see that he's completed the ABC reinforcement application. So just another example of how you can share data between two different applications. Because think about the alternative, and one that I've faced in the past is, in order to get that completion data from one point to the other, you'd have to do a manual process. You'd have to take those CSV files or something, those other flat files from the learning reinforcement application, and manually swivel those things over into the LMS. Maybe it needed to go into a specific CSV import file. We're talking about just human labor to make that happen. Well, let's automate that so we can take those analysts and such and have them do higher order thinking and other types of analysis, rather than some of these lower level things that we can automate. So that's sharing of data for scenario number 2. Now let's go to our final scenario for today, and that's personalization. So how can you use web APIs to personalize a learner experience? And so in this example, we have, once again, a learning management system. And inside of that LMS, we have an e-learning course. And it doesn't matter if you've used Storyline or Captivate or any of the other development applications to create the e-learning course. This is just abstracted as an example. So the idea here is we want this personalized experience where the e-learning course identifies, are they a manager or are they not a manager? And if they are, they go down to this path. And if they're not a manager, they go down to a different path. So how do we make that happen? So in order to make this happen, on page 1 of the e-learning course, when the e-learning course is being launched,
Hey,
because
Kevin,
the learner has launched it.
you have
Yes, Heidi.
you have a meeting invite popped up on the sharing screen. Someone asked if you could grab
Oh,
it.
that's fine.
Thanks.
Thank you. Didn't see that. And I have WebEx closed and all that stuff, so I don't even know. So thank you for calling that out. So when the e-learning course is launched, when it's called up by the learner, there's going to be some code that reaches out to the LMS. So you got an e-learning course in the LMS, and it's going to reach out to the LMS. You're actually within it. And it's going to ask the LMS for that learner web object, the web API object. And it's going to say, give me my information because I am this learner. And what happens is it passes that information off to the e-learning course after that request, saying, here's the learner's name, position, job title, maybe a whole bunch of different things, right? But as you can see, in this example, it says, okay, well, their position is identified as a manager. It could be other things too, like people leader or specific job codes or anything else. But regardless, the e-learning course then takes that and it makes a decision automatically. So it says, okay, this person is a manager, go down this path. So again, all does it programmatically, does it seamless to the user to provide that personalized experience. And alternatively, what would you do if you didn't have this type of automation? You could take different approaches where you're creating a base e-learning course and then you're duplicating it, one for manager, one for non-managers, and then you have a bit of a content management nightmare again, where you have to update things in different locations if you make one change. So that helps get around that. Another implementation that you could potentially use is like on that page 1 of that e-learning course, is you could ask them like, what position level are you, or where are you located at in the company, or something like that. Not as personalized. It's not the greatest user experience, if you will, that you want to get across. But again, the web API automation side of things will help you overcome that. All right, so that is our final scenario, and I hope these scenarios were informative. And I saw there's some chats and whatnot going on too, so we'll definitely get to those. So with that, it is our questions time. So Heidi, I don't know if you've been able to monitor the chat and or the QA. Are there any questions we can tackle?
So in the QA, Kevin, the first question is, what are the key considerations to accept API integration requests from partners?
Gotcha. Okay. I'm not sure if that's from a technical perspective or more from a business perspective. But if I'll kind of approach both. So if this was, let's say, a technical perspective, then having the request, you'd have to typically whoever's creating the web APIs has some type of, like I mentioned before, authentication and very specific technical requirements on how you need to interact with it. Not only the authentication portion of it, but the required parameters, the optional parameters, and things of that nature. I think if we approach it from the business perspective, then yeah, I think it comes down to a number of things, like what's the use cases, right? So, for example, if the data that's being extracted is permissionable, so if certain people should have access to the data and certain people should not have access to the data, you need to have those types of conversations with folks to figure those things out. And I'm sure there's a number of other business examples, but you have to dig in there and really see what's on both sides. Why are people requesting this? And on the opposite side, is there anything that needs to be protected? Is there anything that people should not be authorized to see? And any number of things there. I hope that answered the question. If not, please chat something in so that we can follow up on that.
So thanks, Kevin. The next question is, are APIs needed on both ends? And I can take that. It's one API that connects both of the applications.
Yeah, and so for some of the examples that we provided, it was you have an application that is not it is going to make a what's called a REST call. It's going to make that call, that functional call, but that's not the web API. The web API is typically on the other end. It's just waiting there for something to call it instead. So yeah, I agree with Heidi. That's typically on one end.
The next question, Kevin, is how to address the issue of privacy, especially when needed to limit the access over the API calls if the platform used LMS doesn't include this as a feature.
Address the issue of privacy. Okay. Yeah, so that's going to come down to the business rules that you have related to integration. So not just anybody should be able to come to somebody and say, hey, I need access to your web API library. It shouldn't work in that fashion, number one. There should be certainly some vetting as it relates to, are they the right group? And then digging deeper into the permissionable side of things. So oftentimes when it comes to web API authentication, there's a few different approaches that you can take. Oftentimes there's like this master admin view where you have access to everything via the web APIs. But then you also have different implementations where you assume roles. So let's say you assume the role of a particular job code in order to make a call. And with that being said, that job code or that role only has access to a subset of information. So there's a lot more detail involved in that, but it's going to take some conversations to really get down to what are they looking for and what do they really need access to. Privacy, security, all of that's super important. Hopefully that hit the mark. Again, if it didn't, feel free to chat in as well.
Thanks, Kevin. The next question is, in the e-learning course LMS personalization example, would there be an API set up between the course authoring tool and the LMS and HRIS system?
Gotcha. On the HRIS side, typically not, because you're looking at the e-learning course making a call to the LMS. And oftentimes, information related to HRIS is already in the LMS via some other process as it relates to their name, maybe their employee ID number, their hierarchy within your organization, those types of things. So on the HRIS side, typically not, that's already handled separately. But on the course authoring tool side, it depends on the tool. Some tools handle it differently than others, but oftentimes what you're going to need to do is inject some type of JavaScript into the e-learning course in order to make those web API calls to the LMS. And what's nice about that particular example is that the authentication that typically happens with external applications, where you have an external application that's not in the LMS trying to make a call to the API of the LMS, you need some very strict authentication there. Well, when you have an e-learning course playing within an LMS, oftentimes that authentication is not necessary, and it really helps make the integration a lot easier. So that's not always the case for every situation, but we have encountered both where it's super easy to authenticate because authentication happens inherently because it's within, but then we also found the opposite. So it just kind of depends. You have to explore and go after it that way.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. The next question is, can APIs be used to reference something like SharePoint as a middleman to reference who should be enrolled in a certain learning object or learning objects?
Yeah, I would say the answer is yes. SharePoint has its own API libraries associated with it. I think the key there is that you're likely want to automate that one. You don't want somebody to, push a button every hour or push a button once a day to, check that middleman, right? Or check that SharePoint site for something. So you still need something to automate that part of it. But yeah, you can absolutely have some application check SharePoint, like a SharePoint list, because a list is really, like a spreadsheet or a very small, data table or something like that. Yeah, I can certainly see that happening for sure. Just think about it. I would encourage you to think about it from an automation perspective.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. The last question in Q&A before we move over to chat is, what is the best way to overcome the challenge of identifying users through different systems when you don't have a unique identifier between them or among them?
Yeah, that is super challenging right there. If you don't have a unique identifier, I would say one, start working towards having a unique identifier if you can. But I think you would have to be pretty creative with it. So if I were to translate this into a data example, so from a data example, let's say you had multiple data tables, and not all unique identifiers are going to be the same in those data tables, and so you have to oftentimes have what's called foreign keys. These foreign keys almost create like a translation, if you will. And so maybe you have employee ID as the unique identifier in one application, but then you have email address as a unique identifier in another application, right? So they're not the same, but if they share some of that same data, you can use a foreign key to kind of match them up. It's not always the best scenario because in certain examples, email addresses are reused if employees leave the organization and then somebody comes into the organization, totally different person, but with the same name. So you come into conflicts that way. And so that's why I say if you can get to that unique identifier, it's the best scenario because those unique IDs never get reused. But you can make do. You just have to be super creative with how you translate that data between different data tables and such. Good question. I really appreciate you guys answering or asking those. Very good stuff.
Thanks, Kevin. The only question, and I think I answered it, but if I didn't, let me know, is that could you share an example of the custom learning portal? I didn't share that, but the second question was, are you talking about custom SharePoint sites, for example? And I said, our custom portals are generally websites and not a SharePoint site, but you could use SharePoint as a data point to pull in. But I think you said you can use a SharePoint site for a custom portal, Kevin.
Yeah, SharePoint has SharePoint Designer, and other ways of creating web applications within the SharePoint environment. I would say, and I often tell people that with technology, a lot is possible. The thing that we're often blocked by is our imagination. So, I would start with the imagination first and then work towards technology. So did we answer the one about the shared example of custom learning portals? Was that what you're talking about, Heidi?
I don't know if they were wanting a different custom portal example than what we provided with the LCMS and that custom portal, or if you want to provide another example.
Yeah, I can definitely provide another example. Thanks, Anna, for asking that. And so, one custom portal that we created for the business is related to leadership development. And they wanted a very specific look and feel, but at the same time, they wanted a very specific functionality. And while our learning management system handled some of that, definitely didn't go after the look and feel that they were going after or they wanted. So we were solving for different problems there. But the idea was you have this leadership development application for multiple audiences, and it's based around competencies, and it strings these learning assets together into we'll just call them learning paths, or a specific curriculum, if you will, for each competency. And those learning assets, they'll reach out to different applications within our learning ecosystem. Some of them are videos sitting in our video platform. Some of them are pieces of content sitting in our content management system. Some of them are actual e-learning courses sitting in our learning management system. And yeah, we're connecting all these things together, through web APIs. But that's just one example of some of the custom learning portals that we've created. Hopefully that was helpful.
Thanks, Kevin. I don't see any other questions.
All right, great. Well, thank you for asking those once again. And hopefully, if you were listening to those, that you gain some insight from others. So I really appreciate you guys asking those. So to wrap up our contacts, you can find us on LinkedIn as well as via email on this slide here. Feel free to grab a screenshot of those, reach out. And the final piece is be sure to leave some feedback from an ATD perspective of our session. They look at this, they provide it to us, but also I know they use it going forward to make this session and these sessions better for all into the future. I want to thank you for attending, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye,
Thanks
everyone.
so much.